Chapter 9, Abolitionism in Black and White. The chapter is only 22 pages in length, but it covers several decades and has an awful lot of information. The first 2 pages introduces you to several of the most vocal blacks and white abolitionists. And the first free black mentioned is from Boston. His name is David Walker, who wrote a pamphlet called The Appeal in 1829, where he was urging the overthrow violently of slavery. But yeah, I hope you were sincerely blown away when you read all those names. Dozens and dozens of black names are mentioned as working for abolition as far back as the beginning of the 19th century. They were educated men who not only could read and write, but they could and did speak out openly against slavery. Some of them were escaped slaves like Frederick Douglass, but most were born free and had the benefit of some financial success and little education. But of course there were the white ones, white northern men and women who worked for the same cause. And the most notable white man was, of course, William Lloyd Garrison. Quite a character. Although he doesn't quite look like a character, does he? He didn't start out as a radical, but rapidly became so. He called for non-violent militantism. And I hope you said, huh? That's an oxymoron. Because non-violent means peaceful, passive, or even diplomatic, while militant means radical, confrontational, or combative. You can't have it both ways. You have to pick one. And he was leaning toward militantism. He used his newspaper, The Liberator, to publish his radical views and called for immediate abolition. But by the 1820s, there were as many as 50 black-led anti-slavery societies with the dozens and dozens and dozens of white ones. And I'm not going to repeat all those names, but read them because you've never heard of them before. Now, I'm sure you've heard of Frederick Douglass because he's taught about in American history. So read them, quietly thank them for the work that they did, and never forget there were hundreds and hundreds of blacks working for freedom. Now, the strongest and the largest anti-slavery organization was located in New York, but there were other societies like in Boston and New Haven, Philadelphia. And these societies would hold conventions. And as far back as 1830, when they met, they discussed what should and could be done. Now, after Garrison's newspaper began to be published, they all began to align with him. And while most of the society's members were white, there was an interracial society called the American Anti-Slavery Society. Now, I don't know about you, but I found it interesting that our text authors call these black men the founding fathers of abolitionism, pointing out that they were men of many interests and talents. They gave not only their time, but they gave energy and money. They held membership meetings. They held positions in committees. They helped raise funds to help the escaped slave. And a lot of them were even allowed to serve as officers in the white-dominated societies. But don't forget the women. They played a very important role, too. And they were even some of their own women's societies in the Northeast. And they did the typical women thing. They made homemade stuff. They made clothing and food. They helped circulate petitions. And although public speaking was not their strong suit, well, it might have been if women, black or white, were ever encouraged to speak publicly, but throwing rotten tomatoes is a time-worn method of expressing dislike of a speaker. And any woman who was so bold as to speak in public could expect such treatment. Now, Sarah and Angeline Grinke, which their names are just briefly mentioned, but they're very prominent white sisters in the Northeast who were very, very active, not only in the abolition movement, but the women's rights movement. And they had the audacity to speak publicly, and they also had the ability to do it well. You see, women were considered not only second-class citizens, but in many ways chattel just as a slave. And when some tried to tie women's rights to abolition, it was hotly and very quickly discouraged. After all, a woman's place was in the home, not the public sector. Of course, exceptions were, of course, William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, who believed that women should have some rights. Now, your book doesn't mention this part of it, but the anti-slavery groups did love to have Douglass speak. He was a former slave. He became a great orator and writer and statesman. He helped people escape He was a leader of the abolitionist movement. He spoke out on women's rights. And like I say, societies loved to have him speak. But the more he became known, the more he became afraid of being arrested because of all the fugitive slave laws. So he travels to England one time, and while he's there, he manages to come up with enough money to purchase his own freedom. Now he feels he can come back to the country and speak without being afraid of being arrested. But some of those women's rights groups, they wanted nothing more to do with him. As a matter of fact, they were very angry with him because he had had the audacity to purchase his freedom. Because as a runaway slave, he was a great speaker. But as a free man, he was just another free black. But there were societies where they did allow the runaway slave to speak. Some of them were even paid a salary. And then another lengthy list of names is given to you. But let me spend a little bit of time on someone who we do know. Sojourner Truth. She was born into slavery and took her slave owner's last name, and she was sold several times. And while she was being owned by one family called the Dumont family, she married another slave, the name of, what was his name? I can't remember. Thomas. Okay, Thomas was his name. And she had 5 children by him. And back in 1827, the New York law had emancipated all slaves, but meanwhile, Isabel had already run away with her youngest son, and she was working as a house servant. Their name was Van Wagen, and she used their name briefly. But she discovered that there was a member of the former owner slave family that had sold one of her children into slavery in Alabama. Now, this is where she becomes a little bit different, because there were some unusual happenings in this lady's life. She actually sued to gain release of her son and won. And she had a religious conversion. She moved to New York City and became a member of the Methodist Perfectionist Commune and came under the influence of a religious prophet. Well, the commune fell apart in a few years, and there were allegations of sexual improprieties and even murder. Isabel herself was accused of poisoning, and here again she sued, and she was successful, winning her suit for libel. And she continued the whole time working as a household servant. In 1843, she took the name Sojourner Truth, believing this to be on the instructions of the Holy Spirit, and Sojourner because she's journeying, and the Truth because she's telling the truth. In the late 1840s, she connected with the Abolitionist movement, becoming a very popular speaker. In 1850, she also began speaking on women's suffrage. And her most famous speech is Ain't I a Woman, given in 1851 at a women's rights convention in Ohio. She met Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote about her. And then she moved to Michigan and joined yet another religious commune, this one associated with the Quakers of Friends. And at one point, she was friendly with a group called the Millerites, a religious movement that grew out of Methodism and later will become known as the Seventh-day Adventists. During the Civil War, she raised food and helped gather clothing and contributions for the black regiments, and she actually met Abraham Lincoln in 1864. Now, while she was there in Washington, D.C., this brave woman tried to challenge the discrimination of segregating streetcars by race. After the war, she began to advocate and speak widely for a Negro state in the West. Now, she's speaking mainly to white audiences and mostly on religion. Of course, she did bring in the Negro movement and the women's rights, and she spoke on temperance. But immediately after the Civil War, when she tried to organize efforts to provide jobs for black refugees from the war, she wasn't very successful. Active up until 1875, her grandson, who was her companion, fell ill and died, and being alone, she returned to Michigan, where her health began to deteriorate. In 1883, in Battle Creek Sanatorium, she died of infected ulcers on her legs. And I think, although we've never gone that much into detail, but all the walking this woman did and working in bad weather and helping slaves escape, it's understandable. She had a very well-attended funeral. Now, not only were the people writing pamphlets, black and white, there was even some black newspapers, and yes, most of them were short-lived because of lack of funding. But while they existed, they were very popular. And of course, the most famous paper published by a black man was Frederick Douglass's The North Star. Well, 3 years after he began publishing it, he changed the name to Frederick Douglass's paper, and the gentleman who'd helped him found it left. Now, we've got all kinds of groups, and the evangelical abolitionists had some rather pointed reasons. They said slavery was contrary to the teachings of Christianity. After all, Jesus taught all men were created in the image of God. Slavery was contrary to the principles of the American life. Slavery was economically unsound because people were not paid for their labor. And if you're not paid for your labor, the labor is not going to be efficient. Slavery allows the basis aspect of human nature to surface. And slavery was a menace to the peaceful and safety of the nation. And white slave owners lived in constant fear of slave uprisings. And with all this growing abolitionist rhetoric and the movements in the North, the talk about colonization began to grow anew and in earnest. And although it was never meant as a means of freeing slaves, rather the out of sight, out of mind principle, a gentleman called Bushrod Washington, who happened to be a nephew of George Washington, and Henry Clay of Kentucky, they were leaders in organizing something called the American Colonization Society, which we discussed briefly last time. Now, in Kentucky history, we always discuss two men who worked hard for the abolitionist movement, James Barney and Cassius Marcellus Clay. And both of these men were born in Kentucky to wealthy slave-holding families. And it was only while they were away up north in college that they came under the influence of the abolitionists. Now, of course, their ideas of slave emancipation made them extremely unpopular in the South and with their families. So both men had to leave the South, work in the North. Theodore Dwight Weld, a theologian who taught in the Land Theological Seminary in Cincinnati, he began to encourage his students to not only talk about slavery, to have open debates. The students began to put into practice the things he'd been saying. Before you know it, they're working in the Underground Railroad. Well, the powers to be at the college, they were not too happy about this, and they began to pressure the students to be a little bit more conservative. So the group left the school, went to the northeast corner of Ohio, and formed a college called the Oberlin College. It was not only going to be a co-educational school, but integrated, and it became very quickly a hotbed of abolitionist activity. Later, Weld, Arthur Tappan, and Garrison founded the American Anti-Slavery Society. And although Arthur Tappan was the founding member, his brother Lewis was a very firm and generous supporter. And they began publishing pamphlets and recruiting people to spread the anti-slavery word. It's not going to be long before the Tappan brothers and Garrison had a parting of ways, due primarily to just differences in opinion on rather how hard to press for abolition and maybe even women's rights. When Garrison managed to get some women appointed to committee positions, the howls of rage were heard. The very idea of a woman heading a committee, or the idea of a woman being involved in politics, was unheard of. Oh, by the way, one of the women involved was a lady called Lucretia Mott, who's going to be extremely influential in the women's rights movement. And Lucretia Mott was a reformer who, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, helped found and organize the women's rights movement in the United States. Now, when Miss Mott was very young, she developed a very bad hatred for slavery. She was a Quaker and she was a good student. She became a very good speaker and began speaking out on anti-slavery matters. And she even became a Quaker minister. But to show you give you an example, I guess you'd say, of the emotions involved, on May the 16th in 1838 in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, she was scheduled to speak at an anti-slavery meeting that she had helped organize. Now, at this meeting, they had called for an end or a boycott to any products produced by slave labor. And they also wanted an end to slavery in Washington, D.C. There was a very large jeering crowd outside. The estimates were 17,000. And the angry mob had no use for these women that were in this meeting. And many in this crowd were they were factory workers, barely able to survive on their meager wages. And they asked what would happen to us if the slaves were freed. The competition for jobs would drive wages down even more, in their way of thinking. And when they saw black women attending the convention, it just made them even worse. As I said, Lucretia Mott was 45 at this time, and she was the organizer, and she could not totally ignore the threats of violence. So she had some of the women leave through the back of the building and leave in pairs. And each woman that was black walked out arm in arm with a white woman. Well, the mayor of Philadelphia had heard about it and came down and locked the doors, and he appealed to the crowd for calm. And as soon as he left, the mob broke into the building and set it on fire. And by 9 p.m., the flames were reaching skyward, and this brand new Pennsylvania Hall was in ruins. Well, Mott had already left, but now the mob began to look for their targets, and no one made them more angry than Lucretia Mott. She was a leader. She was a dangerous woman abolitionist. This meddling reformer should be punished, they're crying out. And shouting, "On to Mott's house!" the mob rushed toward her home. Fortunately, a very quick-witted friend saved her and her family from violence by pretending to be a member of the mob and leading them in the wrong direction. But before breaking up, the mob very calmly burned down a black church and a home for black orphans. All this time, Mott, a very tiny woman, barely 5 foot tall and weighing less than 100 pounds, was sitting calmly in her front parlor chatting with friends. She said later, in the hour of danger, she had felt herself strengthened and uplifted. Garrison's group would remain strong in the Northeast, but the group founded by the Tappans would have support in the border states and the West. Tappan's group was against having anything to do with women's rights and saw the advantage of using politics to help end slavery. Garrison's group saw politics as being immoral and corrupt and they claimed to be pacifists. They also were for women's suffrage and for women working. As pointed out in your text, being an abolitionist did not mean you believed in equal civil rights. Black abolitionists began to condemn the whites for being paternalistic and discriminatory. Many, because equal rights were not awarded to blacks in the northern communities, this was their response. And some white female societies would not even let black women attend. A bit hypocritical, huh? Some white abolitionists objected to the blacks having all black meetings. And some of the black abolitionists began to call for an end to slavery using legal means or otherwise. This does not mean that the groups did not work together. They were working for the same ends. They just wanted to follow a different path to achieve the end of slavery. And where they both wanted to end slavery, the blacks also wanted civil rights. What is Newton's third law of motion? For every motion, there is an equal and opposite motion. When a body exerts force, a second body simultaneously exerts force in the opposite direction on that body. So it is with the anti-slavery movement. There is a pro-slavery backlash. The South is now no longer apologizing or calling slavery a necessary evil. Instead, they begin to say slavery is good for the black man. It's good for the Southern white. It's good for all Americans. And they had a couple of arguments. Number one, they said blacks are biologically and mentally inferior. And physicians, using the measurement of the head as an example, made this statement. And because of the black anatomy, they could take punishment without as much pain as the white man. And they were subject to disease. It's called, I don't know if I can, Dreptomania, Drapetomania, which made them run away. White man didn't have that disease. Slavery was necessary for the civilization and survival of the South. The products produced were absolutely necessary. And blacks were destined to be subordinate because history shows that the black man has never been able to rise above. And in ancient Rome, blacks were used as house servants because they were so suited for that type of work. And of course, the old standby, slavery's in the Bible. Didn't you love that section of your text where the Southern preachers were saying the person was black because of the curse of Ham, and God had created the black man to use as slaves? Yet consider this, if the black man could not be civilized, how could he become Christianized? big discrepancy in their argument. Some of the northern ministers didn't like this type of rhetoric, and it would cause a split in all the prominent Protestant denominations. Now, any anti-slavery talk or disagreement on the virtues of slavery could and did cause problems if you had the audacity to express the idea. You could be run out of town or have your property mysteriously disappear or destroyed. If you owned a newspaper, it could be broken into and destroyed. And when it became obvious that the federal government was not going to do anything, it became very widespread, and even anti-slavery in the mails in the South was banned. Now, President Andrew Jackson believed in slavery and even approved of the ban on the anti-slavery publications in the South. Next step, try to stop those abolitionist leaders. And William Lloyd Garrison had a $4,000 reward for his arrest. Arthur Tappan was $12,000 in Macon, Georgia, and $20,000 in New Orleans. Anyone who helped, any writer, speaker, or a conductor on the Underground Railroad had a reward on his or her for the capture in the South. In addition, some Southerners even tried to spy their way into the free states to gain free information. They, seek into meetings and try to find out where the runaway slaves were, and as soon as they would be discovered, they would run away. But unfortunately, they would also have information at the time. But all is not just talk. In some cases, talk gave way to, shall we say, overt action. In the 1830s and 40s, most people in the North didn't like the radical abolitionists, and some even condemned the abolitionist societies as supporting interracial marriage and mixed-race population. Some papers wrote of the abolitionists posing a threat to the social and political order of the country. And in July 1834, a northern mob destroyed the Tappans' home and burned churches that belonged to the black people in New York City. An abolitionist newspaper could be destroyed, and in Alton, Illinois, the editor's paper was destroyed, and he himself was killed. Getting a place to hold meetings was getting more and more difficult. Mobs would break up the meetings, and any woman who openly spoke about slavery could be subjected to insults. And the three presidents at this time, Jackson, Polk, and Taylor, were pro-slavery, did nothing to lessen it. Congress even passed an unofficial gag rule. Any bill that had anything to do with slavery was tabled and never undertaken. It was just too hot a topic to speak of openly. Of course, former President John Quincy Adams was against it, and it wasn't rescinded until 1845. One result of the killing of the abolitionists in Illinois and the gag rule seemed to bring on a small bit of change in the attitude of those in the North. It was pointed out in a very passionate speech that this gag rule prevented whites from exercising their First Amendment, and slavery did deny freedom to the blacks. The people of the North thought most abolitionists were fanatics, but were beginning to see slavery as something that threatened the liberty of all Americans. In 1840, a new political party was formed called the Republican Party, and it called for free soil, free speech, free labor, free men. And although it seems strange to us today that the Republican Party was openly opposed to slavery, but it was not an abolitionist party. And of course, any state where a black man could vote, they joined the Republican Party, and Frederick Douglass, of course, was one of the first to join. So how did the black community react to all this goings on? Well, they spoke out against the arguments, especially the one about using science as a justification of slavery. It's a misuse of science. And there were those who wrote and tried to prove the superiority of the African peoples. We call them Afrocentrists today. Now, the actual meaning of the word is that the African history and culture began in ancient Egypt, which was the birthplace of the world civilization. And Egypt presided over a unified black Africa until its ideas and technologies were stolen and its records of accomplishment obscured by Europeans. They say that everything that was good and invented were discovered by a black man. They said Cleopatra was black, that the Athenians did not invade Africa. It was the other way around. And of course, Socrates got his information and philosophies from a black man. Now, Douglas, of course, spoke out against these theories that the black man was of a different species than the white man. And slaves themselves repudiated the idea that a slave was happy, contented by relating slave horror stories. And there were numerous stories written by white writers on the stories they had heard, but there were also stories written by the runaway slave himself, the most notable being Frederick Douglass. So not only did we have slave recitals, but actual histories being written by black writers. There were some black writers who wrote plays, and there were even some who were writing the histories and biographies of black soldiers. The Underground Railroad, that's a subject everybody seems to think they know the most about. And of course, you think it's a large organization and well organized. No. It did cause a lot of resentment in the South. And that story of how it supposedly got its name was humorous, but no one knows for sure. And you can go on the internet and find hundreds of stories of how the slave managed to escape, always trying to stay hidden until they crossed the Ohio River into a free state. Well, after 1850, there was no guarantee of crossing that Ohio River and being in a free state is going to guarantee your freedom. And in the beginning of the slave exodus, of course, most of the runaways were young, healthy males. And they run at night. So women with children, not a good idea, because children cry when they shouldn't. And it's hard to run with a baby on your hip. But most of the runners, with help of other white and black people, would reach Pennsylvania and New Jersey, hopefully to get to Boston and on into Canada. It was a long and dangerous trip, and it took a lot of resources, material and financial. And of course, clothing and food was in the forefront because the escaping slave had nothing to begin with, and if he did, he couldn't take it with him. Now, your text makes a statement that I find rather amusing. They said that the flight would begin on plantations in the South. Duh, you think? They certainly wouldn't have begun up north. It would have begun where the slave was located, on plantations in the South. But now, if you were in the upper South, this is what happened. If you were in lower Georgia, Mississippi, or Alabama, chances are you're not going to try to make it to Boston. You're going to head in the other direction for New Orleans or one of the islands. And the men and women who would aid would be called conductors. And that delightful story in the text about John Fairfield and his work for decades. He unfortunately died before the war, and he did not see slavery ended. He's credited with helping almost 3,000 escape, and at one time a group of 28. One time he even impersonated a white slave seller to gain the confidence of the white slaveholders in the South and be able to move around with his black slaves. But not all of the conductors were white. There were also black ones. And it's mentioned Elijah Anderson and John Mason, who is credited with helping over 2,300 escape. But the most famous and the one you learned about in American history is Harriet Tubman, which we talked about a couple of chapters ago in Southern slavery. Just a real quick review. She was a very strong-willed but small woman, small in body. And she had spells of dizziness because she'd been hit in the head when she was a slave. And she had plans that she worked at. She always traveled at night, and she preferred the winter and preferred to start on the weekend because it would be, the beginning of the next week. She'd have a couple of days before the word ever got out. The black people called her Moses, and she's credited with between 70 and 80 passengers. They never lost a passenger. Now, the debate over moving slaves into the newly acquired territories of the West continued and grew stronger in the 1850s. And California's gold strike in 1849 only intensified the problems. Now, there were three sides to the question. The abolitionists wanted slavery excluded entirely in all the new areas. Okay. The South wanted to take their property and go west. And then there was a group that said, well, let the new territories and new states decide for themselves. There was no solid consensus. Now, there had been fugitive slave laws on the books since before the Revolution, but they were not always enforced. In 1842, the Supreme Court upheld a 1793 law requiring the national governments had a responsibility to help return runaway slaves. But, and a big but, it also ruled that the state and local officials were not required to assist in the return. So there was a back door out. Without local help, it was going to be extremely difficult to get a runaway slave. California. A gold strike in 1849 had caused the area to grow so much and so fast and so quickly that she had to have help, and the best way to get help was to become a state and get federal aid. So she requested to be admitted to the United States as a free state, and the South started to howl. Enter Senator Henry Clay, a Kentuckian called the Great Compromiser, the man responsible for the Missouri Compromise. He had a proposal that was mammoth, but Clay was old and sick and didn't have the physical strength to push the bill through Congress. Enter Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, who broke that bill down into smaller bills and managed to get each one, after a lot of arm twisting, passed. Now the gist of the bill was California would enter the Union as a free state. The new Western territories would be organized into future states without any mention of slavery. And they paid Texas's debts from the previous road to statehood. They forbid the sale of slaves in D.C. They ended it. They settled the border dispute between Texas and Mexico. And the last and most controversial part, of course, was something called the Fugitive Slave Act, which was not new, but this time it's going to be mandated that the local officials have to assist to find a runaway. And slaves that had felt secure in free states now had to look behind them and not be as trusting of a strange white man. In reality, all a white man had to do was have an affidavit signed by another white man claiming a black man as a slave. And the local officials were required by federal law to assist. And we have documented cases of blacks being born free in the North being forcibly taken south as slaves. In some cases, when this would happen, the local towns would come up with enough money to purchase the freedom of the arrested black man to keep him from being taken back. But it's been estimated that some 400 were returned between 1850 and 1861. Of course, that's only an estimate. And there were some that were not documented. Again, as stated in your text, both black and white men in the North got into a lot of trouble aiding and escaped slaves. And the bill was supposed to have dampened the slavery issue. However, it only intensified it. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and she wrote it very badly, I must say. It was, of course, banned in the South. It was a story of the cruelty of slavery and supposedly based on the story of the Kentucky slave. Well, it was in a way. The slave's name was Josiah Henson. And those of you in western Kentucky area who ever travel Highway 60 east will see a marker saying the Josiah Henson Trail. He was not from a plantation in central Kentucky. He escaped from a plantation just off of Thurston-Dermont Road. He was originally a slave in Maryland, but his owner was a bad gambler and put up his slaves for collateral when he lost at cards. And when he found out the local sheriff was coming out to get his slaves, he sent Josiah along with others to his brother in Kentucky. Story time. Now, if you were in class, you would know I love to tell stories. And Josiah was from Maryland, and as I said, his owner, a man named Riley, was a bad gambler, so he puts him up for collateral. And when the sheriff said he was going to get the slaves, Mr. Riley in Maryland had Joshua take his family and a couple of dozen others to his brother in Kentucky. Now, I know this is very small, but I wanted to give it all to you in one place instead of trying to drag it out. Henson was born into slavery in June of 1789 in Maryland, and he was sold several times before he was 18. He wound up being owned by a man named Riley, who also had a brother in Kentucky. And this is where he sent Joshua. And Joshua was the epitome of a good slave. He did what he was told. He was smart. He was healthy. He was, in fact, the overseer of the Riley plantation in Maryland. Now, he'd been promised his freedom as soon as he could earn a couple of $100. So he takes his family and a couple of dozen other slaves, and he walks all the way from Maryland to Kentucky. And while he's out here, he works for the brother Amos Riley and became a Methodist minister and gave talks for which people would pay him. In 1830, he had saved up $350 to buy his freedom. And about the same time, Riley in Maryland sent word to his brother in Owensboro to sell all the slaves except Josiah and his family and have Josiah bring the money to him, which is what happened. And having raised the necessary $350, Joshua was hopeful and looking forward to his freedom. However, when he got to Maryland, the old master raised the price to $1,000, took Joshua's 350 and told him he was not free. And Joshua returned to Kentucky, more than a little bit unhappy that he was still a slave. A bit later, the brother here in Owensboro receives word from the brother in Maryland to sell Joshua. So Amos puts him with his son on a boat to go down south, down the river, to sell Joshua. Well, lo and behold, the son gets sick. So Joshua gets off the boat with the son and nurses him back to health, and then brings him back to Owensboro to his father. Well, by this time, Joshua's finally got it through his head that they're going to sell him. So he better do something about it, and he decides to run. And he buys his time, he earns some more money, and then finally one night, about 3 years after his arrival in Kentucky, he and his family crossed the Ohio River, and they did have help. They had the Underground Railroad help them, and they had some Native Americans. And to make a long story short, they made their way to Canada and freedom. And he, with the help of Quakers there, founded something called the Dawn Institute, which was a settlement for fugitive slaves near Ontario. And there they would learn how to do something other than pick cotton. They could learn how to be a successful farmer, to do other work. He also began working on the Underground Railroad himself, and he helped hundreds of slaves escape to freedom to Canada, because Canada had no extradition law. So if you got to Canada, you were safe. He published his autobiography, The Life of Josiah Henson, in 1849. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe read this book and contacted him to do an interview. So she had visited a slave plantation in central Kentucky, but she got her information from Joshua, who, by the way, didn't have a mark on his body anywhere. He was a good slave. By doing what he was told to do, he had never been whipped. He had never had his ears cut. He had never had his Achilles tendon chopped. He knew what to do. So the stories he was telling her about the cruelties that he saw were things he had seen or heard about, not things that had happened to him. But during the next several decades, like I say, he traveled not only into Canada, and after the war, and having met President Lincoln, he actually sailed to England, and while there, he was given lectures on his life as, quote, Uncle Tom, unquote, and he was actually presented to Queen Victoria. He died on May the 5th, 1883, in Dresden, Ontario. And FYI only, he's the first black man to be featured on a Canadian stamp, and his great-grandnephew was named Matthew Henson, who just happened to accompany Robert Perry on his North Pole trip. Okay. Now a little bit about American history. And by the way, when Lincoln was introduced to Harriet Beecher Stowe, she said, "So you're the little lady who started all this." Your text gives you a good brief analysis of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but you don't really see the emotion. Our country's grown by leaps and bounds, from sea to sea, but the only way to get goods to the West Coast was a very dangerous journey over desert, mountains, and fight Indians, or get on a ship and sail down around South America. And both were long and dangerous. The solution seemed to be a railroad across country. It made sense. We had the land, we had the know-how, so build it. So what's the problem? Well, let's back that map a little bit. Okay. The people being what they are, well, the people in the North wanted to start a train station from Chicago and go all the way across. Well, the people down here in New Orleans said, we're a big old port. We've got this great big old Gulf down here, and we got ships coming in from all over. I think we need to start the railroad from here and go to the southern route. Okay. Well, there's a little bit of a problem. As you can see, we got Louisiana and Texas, but these are territories. And here we've got unorganized totally. So what's the big deal? So in January of 1854, a young man by the name of Senator Stephen Douglas introduces a bill that would divide the land west of Missouri into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. He argues for popular sovereignty, which would give the settlers of the new territory the right to decide whether they wanted to come into states as federal and legal. But since it was this Indian territory, you couldn't just take a train across. The anti-slavery supporters were outraged because under the terms of the Missouri Compromise, slavery would be outlawed. Like I say, here's the Missouri Compromise line, and here's the Kansas-Nebraska area. And this is supposedly outlawed all slavery in this area. Well, after months of debate, The Kansas-Nebraska Act passed in 1854, and pro-slavery and anti-slavery both rushed to the Kansas area, each side hoping to determine the results of the first election. The conflict turned violent, aggravation, split between the North and South until reconciliation was virtually impossible, and as a matter of fact, Kansas got the reputation of being bleeding Kansas. Now, the problem being is most of the people who went to the northern area of Kansas were hard-working German farmers. And it wasn't that they were so much against slavery, they just didn't need it. The people in the South, people from Missouri, had come over totally to vote illegally. Here again, look at this map. Here is Missouri, slave. Here's Arkansas, slave. The last thing Missouri wanted was a free state next to them. It would be tempting, almost as tempting as that Ohio River is in Kentucky slaves, but it'd be a much easier place to run to and hide because there's so much more of it. But as a result of all this, and men by the hundreds pouring into Kansas to the election, we wound up with two governments. An anti-slavery government in the North, a pro-slavery government in the South. Now, is this going to cause problems? Well, of course it is. It could have been eliminated had people recognized the right of others to have different ideas. But the radical pro-slavers were not going to have any of this, and they began causing problems. And one of the things they did was raid the town of Lawrence, which is just outside of Kansas City. Like I said, the North was free, and the South was slave. Violence. Town of Lawrence, which is just outside of what we know as Kansas City today, and men dying. Enter John Brown. Now, John Brown was, well, born in Connecticut in 1800, and he moved all over, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and finally living in New York. He was married twice. His first wife died. In between, the second time he married a teenager, and he ended up having 20 children. He hated slavery. He gave land to fugitive slaves. He raised a black child. He lived in a black community. He had trouble holding a job, too. He tried many different jobs, and he never seemed to work. He worked as a farmer, a wool merchant, a tanner, a land speculator. He even filed for bankruptcy. He helped establish a league that would help protect escaped slaves from slave catchers. He followed 5 of his sons to Kansas to help the abolitionists. In 1847, Frederick Douglass actually met John Brown in Springfield, Massachusetts. And of that meeting, Douglass stated that, quote, "Though a white man, Brown is in sympathy a black man, and as deeply interested in our cause as though his own soul had been pierced with the iron of slavery." It was at this meeting that John Brown had supposedly outlined his plan to Douglass to lead a war to free the slaves. Brown first moved to a black community, which had been established thanks to the philanthropy of a New York Quaker. But Brown didn't really emerge as a major figure of any significance until after 1855, when he followed his sons to Kansas, where he was going to help them. And his method of help, he brought ammunition and guns to help. And he began raiding all around Missouri and Kansas to liberate slaves and property of pro-slavers. The man's life story is fascinating, especially the last couple of years. He goes to a pro-slavery town and kills 5 men with a machete. He discovered later that this pro-slavery town, the men he killed were not pro-slavery, they were anti-slavery. But nothing's done about it. And he continues to liberate for a year. Then he has a vision. He's going to lead a slave army, and he goes back east. Now, folks, I do this when I have a class, an on-campus class, and I've never done this for a online class before. We're going to give it a try. Let's see what happens. Come on. It's supposed to come on. It's not going to do it. Huh. Oh, now I know why I don't do it online classes. I will post this John Brown's Raid in American Memory as a separate YouTube. I apologize. When I made the PowerPoint, it worked just fine. But I guess it had something to do with while I'm recording, I can't record something else. Anyway, my apologies. He very quickly, he had 21 men on a raid to a federal arsenal, 5 blacks and 16 whites at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He's going to take over this arsenal and arm the slaves with weapons, and it's not going to work. The little YouTube will explain a little bit further. He was wounded and quickly captured and tried and convicted of treason. I want you to listen carefully to the end, the people who are praising him and the people who are against him. Like I said, with all these problems, reputation, Kansas came bleeding Kansas. And in a way, it was just a brief look at what's going to lay ahead in the Civil War. A preview, if you would. But with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Compromise of 1850, bleeding Kansas, we also had another blow in the quarter of the pro-slavers. The compromise hadn't settled things like it was supposed to. It's called the Dred Scott case. Now, Dred Scott had been a slave to an army doctor. And I don't doubt history at all, but some of the interpretations of it bothers me. I'm not going to retell the story because it's in the text, but stop and think a minute. Dred Scott had a pretty good job. He wasn't beaten. He didn't pick cotton. He traveled regularly. He got to go into free states and other states. And somewhere along the line, he contacts a lawyer and sues for his freedom rather than running away. Of course, he was awarded his freedom based on the argument of being in free states. But the Supreme Court of Missouri overturned the conviction, and the slave seemed to have got all he could get. But then Missouri overturned it, and he was now a slave again. And then he takes the whole case to the United States Supreme Court. And when I first read this, I thought, where did he get the money? Who told him about these things? Who helped him? Was the idea of the suit even his own idea? I'm not completely satisfied with the answers to those questions. Now, my personal feelings are that he had been contacted by a group of abolitionists who wanted the case to go to the Supreme Court and have it ruled federally that once a slave gets in a free state, he becomes free. Not a bad strategy. But he won the first case, and I can only imagine the upset people's head when that blew that. But then when it was overturned, they were very gleeful. Now, my dear students, there are sometimes organizations, for instance, like the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, that will stir up things just to get it to court. The analogy would be like putting a burr under the saddle on a horse just to get him to buck. But the decision of the Supreme Court was certainly not what was expected. On March 6, 1857, after 11 long years, 7 of the 9 justices agreed with the outcome delivered by Chief Justice Robert Taney, who announced that slaves were not citizens of the United States and therefore had no rights to sue in federal courts. They had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. And also, by the way, that Missouri Compromise, unconstitutional. Congress did not have the authority to prohibit slavery. The Dred Scott case sparked outrage in the northern states and, of course, glee in the South. This growing schism between the North and the South is going to make civil war totally inevitable. The North, just another proof to them that the South was trying to take control of the country. Now, Peter Blow's sons, these are the names. Blow was the name of the original owner of Dred Scott before he was sold to the Army surgeon. They said that they'd been childhood friends and that they're the ones who helped pay Scott's legal fees throughout the years. Well, you've got 11, 12 years of legal fees to pay. And after the Supreme Court's decision, the former master's sons actually purchased Scott and his wife and set them free. And the irony being, 9 months after he was set free, he died. The turbulent 1850s, a decade full of heated arguments and violence over slavery, is finally going to erupt when the anti-slave Republican Mr. Abraham Lincoln gets elected as president in 1860. Led by South Carolina less than 1 month after the election, the Confederate States of America were born. And our next chapter, chapter 10, is, of course, the Civil War. It's 24 pages in length, but we're not going to be covering any big battles because this is not an American history class. You will find the chapter interesting and be surprised at some of the things that the African Americans do and some of the things that are done to them.